trip. I'll have to get my diary and consult my better half as to whether she's available for us both to go. I have been on one of the trips, the one that was organised by Rod Shearing when we went to Kangaroo Island. That was absolutely excellent, and I know that since then, Jock has taken members of the society down to the Limestone Coast and into Victoria, and that too got rave reviews. So it's well worth investigating this trip that he's planning later in the year. Now, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker who's going to talk about how high am I. Are you going to be in feet and inches? Because I can't do metric. I'm 5'11" and 3/4. I never made that final quarter, but never mind. So how high am I? The history of the Australian Height Datum. Now, Graham, like me, comes from the US. At the moment, from the UK. He's senior lecturer in surveying at Flinders University. He's got a Bachelor of Engineering in Civil Engineering from the University of Leeds. And he then completed an MSc in Geodetic Surveying at the University of Nottingham. He has plenty of practical professional background as a surveyor, 18 or so years working in Australia and the UK. And he began lecturing in the early 2020s. He's a registered surveyor. He's currently the chair of South Australia for the Geospatial Council of Australia. And he spent his career advocating for and promoting the geospatial industry. He's now joined the dark side of university lectureship, but he's excited to be supporting the next generation of professionals and future leaders on their geospatial journeys. All yours, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. First things first, can you all hear me okay? Yes. A little bit louder? How about that? Okay. Hopefully, just remind me when we get towards the end, there's a video, and I don't want to blow everybody's remaining eardrums by having that too loud, but hopefully I'll remember to turn it back down. So, welcome to tonight's talk, How High Am I? So, an initial important clarification. If you're expecting something to do with trying to get high, this is not the right location. Today, we're going to go through a brief introduction, talk about why a vertical datum is important, and then we'll go through the establishment of AHD. And then after that, we'll touch on modernizing AHD and why that came around, and then ultimately have a bit of a look to the future as to where we go to from here. So a very brief introduction to myself. Guy's already kindly explained quite a lot, but senior lecturer in surveying, and my background is surveying. It's now actually past chair. I actually managed to hand that over a few weeks ago, but until recently I was chair for the Geospatial Council of Australia, and I'm also program convener for Spatial Information Day, which is the one-day geospatial conference that we have here in Adelaide once a year. So that's coming up in 22nd of August, which is a Friday if anyone's interested. So today we are going to explore what I believe is to be one of the greatest surveying feats in the modern era. At the front, I've actually got a bit of a show and tell. So the level that you can see on screen there's an example of one of those down the front. You're gonna have to put them. So yeah, there's one of these. So feel free to come down and have a look at this at the front of the room at the end. And we're going to share the story of how the Australian Height Datum came about. But before we get into that, I want to just touch on why a vertical datum is important. So the definition of a vertical datum is a vertical reference surface and typically aligned to mean sea level. So that mean sea level is very important, and it's what we use in surveying and geodesy as our reference for vertical. And why is it important to understand height? There's multiple reasons. So first of all, gravity. If we're designing a sewer system, we want to make sure that the contents of those pipes flow in the direction that it's been designed. Anything otherwise is a problem. And so any management of water, it's very important for us that we're able to define what is height relative to gravity. But equally, sea levels, if we want to understand how they're rising or changing over time, very important to understand height. But a modern example of where it's really important to understand height, in the Pilbara, There's a local survey firm, hydrographic survey firm, who have a 24/7 operation to measure the depth of the channels coming in and out of the Pilbara ports. If they can prove there's an extra 100 mil of draft available for the vessels, they'll load extra iron ore onto those vessels worth over $1 million. So all of a sudden, 100 mil is worth serious money. River systems. If we have gauging stations along our river network, we can then have flood risk management and modeling. If we know there's a big weather event coming up, we can model that and try and understand what the flood risk is to the communities downstream. Built environment. Pretty much anything that gets built, we need to understand level. Everything through zoning restrictions and right to light, all the way through to understanding what elevation the lift needs to stop so that it works for each floor of a high rise. And resources. If we're going to explore, we're finding these ore bodies underground, we need to know what depth they are relative to the surface and relative to the surrounding natural environment to work out whether it's financially feasible to actually extract the ore from the ground. So that's a whole bunch of stuff about why. Now let's actually talk about the history and the establishment of AHD. So Australia's actually had localized vertical datum since the mid-1800s. So here on the right-hand side, we can see a plug in the wall that was established in 1882. And that plug is actually connected to the tide gauge at Fort Denison in Sydney Harbour. And you can see from the reading there, it's 28 feet, 11 1/4 inches above mean sea level. So if we convert that to metric, because we now live in a metric world, sorry, Guy, we would get a value of 8.82 meters. Now, this plug is still in the Survey Mark database. So I actually looked up PM 50,000 in the New South Wales Survey database, and the current published elevation for that mark is 8.775 meters above mean sea level. So 8.775 Australian height datum. So it's actually only 45 mil difference now compared to, what, 1880 something? Like mid-1880s. So it sort of shows the importance of vertical datum. It's been used and recognized for a long, long time. But prior to AHD, there was some leveling control, mainly New South Wales, Victoria, WA. But they were very much local datums and they were not connected to each other. And why do we need to worry about that? And why do we maybe need a national datum? Basically, to be able to communicate. If we're going to actually start trying to map Australia at a national level, we need to be able to communicate in the same language. So we can't have mean sea level defined as one thing in WA versus New South Wales versus anywhere else in Australia. So if we think a very simplistic example of trying to build a road from Adelaide to Melbourne, but we actually start at both ends, and we both refer to mean sea level, but it's two different definitions. And when we meet in the middle, it just doesn't work. You hit a big wall. So it was realized that to advance Australia's mapping capabilities, we needed to have some national datums. So let's now go through the important historical dates of the establishment and, well, the idea and then the realization of AHD. So it actually all starts at Federation. The Commonwealth Gazette of the 1st of January 1901 established the Department of Home Affairs to carry out a servicing role. And while surveying and mapping functions were seen as appropriate for a servicing department, none were ceded by the states to the Commonwealth. However, with the passing of the Commonwealth Lands Acquisition Act of 1906, a number of surveying and mapping functions transferred to the states, from the states to the Commonwealth. So this allowed the Commonwealth's small civilian mapping requirements to be met, and so began the story towards AHD. Now, a resolution from the Conference of the Surveyors General in Melbourne during the 20th to the 25th of May 1912 contained detailed proposals for a national geodetic survey of Australia. That conference recognised that such a geodetic survey was absolutely necessary for the production of accurate maps. And then in 1921, the topographic mapping became a Commonwealth responsibility finally within the Lands and Survey branch of the Department of Home and Territories. Notwithstanding this development and the pockets of work undertaken by the Royal Australian Survey Corps, nationally there had been no progress on surveying or mapping. It was all just talk, although it's sort of understandable given some of the other world events that had recently taken place. Throughout the 1920s, there was numerous reports into the need to upgrade Australia's mapping infrastructure. During the first interstate conference of the Australian Surveyors Institute held in Melbourne in November of 1927, the director of the Commonwealth Lands and Surveys delivered a paper called The Need for a Geodetic Survey of Australia. And in 1929, the Australian Survey Committee was formed. This committee had representatives from surveyors, engineers, mining and metallurgy, academia, the Victorian Government astronomer, and the Development and Migration Commission provided the secretary, and input was received from the Department of Defence, the Department of Commonwealth Lands and Survey, so a lot of people. Around this time, the chair of the Development and Migration Commission requested that the chair of the Australian Survey Committee put forward a national scheme of topographical mapping. This scheme was contained in the report on the need for a geodetic and topographical survey of Australia, and the Australian Survey Committee continued to meet into the 1930s. However, due to a lack of government support and financial limitations, no funding was provided and nothing really progressed beyond talk. So there was a lot of people in the room and they very much enjoyed talking, but again, no actual progress. Prior to World War II breaking out, the government established the Commonwealth Survey Committee in late 1935 with the view of ensuring the future coordination of surveys throughout Australia. So the Commonwealth Survey Committee was chaired by the Commonwealth Surveyor General with representatives from the three Defence Forces, Navy, Army and Air Force, and coordinated with the states through their Surveyors General as well. The Commonwealth Survey Committee reported in 1936, but its recommendations were deferred as World War II intervened, and they did not meet again until August of 1944. So by the outbreak of World War II, less than 2% of Australia had been mapped. Now, World War II actually highlighted some of the issues that had been discussed over and over, but no action had been taken. The Commonwealth Surveyor General recalled, the inadequacy of our maps became more fully apparent when the Japanese were on our threshold in 1942. It is probable that they were better informed on the topography of parts of New Guinea than we ourselves were. Clearly, World War II was a bit of a wake-up call, and this predicament led to the instigation of the Emergency Mapping Scheme in November of 1940. In August of 1944, as we said, the Commonwealth Survey Committee met again, finally, and passed 13 resolutions. The CSC held the opinion that as a national undertaking, a national survey should be financed by the Commonwealth. Makes sense. This resulted in the organisation of a conference for the Commonwealth Survey Committee and State Surveyors General held from the 15th to the 19th of January 1945. The recommendation of that conference received Commonwealth government approval on the 7th of March 1945, resulting in the formation of the National Mapping Council. So finally, we actually had a body that would prove to be effective in actually doing and not just talking. So over the following years, there was lots of political back and forth as membership of the various committees and councils was changed and juggled. And while the emergency mapping scheme had driven some progress, by 1951, it was estimated only 12% of Australia was covered by topographic maps. And most of these lacked any height information whatsoever. However, in May of 1951, Major General Brown, Director General of the Ordnance Survey of Great Britain, was invited to Australia to report to the Minister for the Department of the Army on specific terms of reference. Two of the points Brown raised would actually prove instrumental in Australia's mapping future. The first, that so far as mapping is concerned, Australia has yet done little, such that a change to decimal scales and even the metre would be a simple matter now compared with what it will be later when Australia is better mapped. And so at that point, Australia was set down that metric path. And secondly, that Australia needed to have a single mapping authority responsible for its national mapping activities. In 1954, in response to Brown's report, the Commonwealth Government established the Department of Interior as that responsible authority for topographic surveys and mapping in Australia. And one of the first projects of the National Mapping Council was to set up and begin the Australian National Levelling Network. We're getting closer. So from 1945 to 1950, New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australian state authorities, along with assistance from the Royal Australian Survey Corps, had commenced some levelling. So we can hopefully just make out the red lines. There's really not much. So by that point, there was just under 5,000 kilometres of levelling. So still significant distance. Shows the problem when the country you're trying to establish a datum for is also a continent. Between 1956 and 1960, an additional 16,000 kilometres were levelled, expanding into Queensland and the Northern Territory. And by 1965, the total amount of control levelling had reached 129,000 kilometres. So in 1965, the Minister for National Development was instructed to undertake a topographic mapping programme covering the whole of Australia at a scale of 1 to 100,000 and with 20-metre contour intervals. And now we've started to at least have the sort of infrastructure needed to be able to facilitate that. And off the back of that, the opportunity was then taken to extend existing third-order levelling surveys, and by the end of 1970, 161,000 kilometres of levelling had been completed of various different orders and accuracies. So if we just think about those numbers, over 97,000 kilometres of primary levelling, super high precision. It is not easy to chase accuracy when you're levelling or anything with surveying, to be honest. An additional 80,000 kilometres of supplementary levelling, so lower order, less accuracy, you can do it a little bit quicker, giving a total of over 177,000 kilometres of levelling, which is hard to just get your head around. So that also equates to almost 4.5 times the circumference of the Earth at the equator, which is a significant undertaking. And this is your sort of typical three-party team that would have done a lot of that levelling. So here you can see generally 2 vehicles, minimum of 3 people, and they would have to take all of their resources with them because they'd be away for weeks and months at a time, levelling across some pretty inhospitable environments. And the picture is actually one of Barry Sloane's. And here we can actually see the Division of National Mapping's precision levelling section from around 1972. And Barry Sloane is sat on the bottom row on the far right-hand side just there. So I've talked a lot about levelling, a little bit of basic levelling theory for those who've not had to do any before. If we take our temporary benchmark and we set our level up and we use gravity to define horizontal, then we can hold our staff to the TBM and do a backsight and measure up the staff, basically. If we then move that to our change point and take a foresight, we can measure down, and from that we can transfer the elevation from our temporary benchmark to our control point. And you literally just rinse and repeat that. I think pretty much every surveyor will have an anecdote of some horrible levelling project where they spent weeks walking backwards and forwards along roads. I know I've definitely had 1 or 2 in my time, levelling for tens of kilometres along Northern Territory outback roads in the heat, fighting the heat haze and the flies and everything else. Now, so far we've talked about the challenge of levelling across a country that's also a continent, but that was only actually part of the challenge. one more. So if we go back to this very early picture, it was tied to mean sea level, which is easy to define at individual locations. But if we're trying to establish a national datum, we need to understand mean sea level at a national level. So the next challenge that they had to overcome was working out how to do that. So the definition of mean sea level used to define the Australian height datum was actually based on tide gauges, monitoring mean sea levels, and taken from readings between 1966 and 1968 at 30 locations around Australia. And all of these locations would have been tied into the Australian National Levelling Network so that we could then combine the two data sets and work towards that final definition of the Australian height datum. And you'll see down in Tassie, they're actually a different colour because Tassie has its own datum. It is different to the mainland Australia. And their datum is based on tide gauges at Burnie and Hobart only, and is a different datum. So if you happen to be out there with GPS and you go down to Tassie, you need to make sure that you've got the correct settings so that you're using the correct version of Australian height datum. And there's actually a difference between the two datums that can range, and it's been speculated what that range is, and I couldn't actually find a definitive answer within the papers that I used to research this, but some say it's only about 10 millimeters difference, some say it's up to 260 millimeters in difference. So what is mean sea level? Here we've got a diagram very much around hydrographic tidal datum. So we've got mean sea level, we've got the mean sea surface, which is dynamic and changes due to pressure systems, weather, salinity, temperature, all sorts of different things. We've got mean dynamic topography. We've got lowest astronomical tide, very important chart datum, so that vessels know how shallow it is in the worst case tidal scenarios. And tide gauge 0 chart datum. So this starts to show the relationship with them all. And it's also got a couple of words over here that I'm not going to go too far into right now, but we're going to come back and revisit what they are later on. Now I'm going to go off on a tangent for a moment, so please bear with me. But to understand how tricky it is to determine mean sea level at a continental scale, we also need to explore some basic tidal theory. So we know that the Earth and the Moon are tied together by gravity. And as we orbit around the Sun, the Moon stays in its position relative to the Earth, and we all orbit in sync due to gravity. And the Moon's gravitational effect on the water bodies of the Earth is to create this bulge in line with the Moon's alignment. But what's really interesting is as the tide comes in and goes out twice a day, there or thereabouts, it's not the water moving around the Earth. It's actually the Earth moving relative to those water bodies. Because the powers of gravity are greater than the powers of the Earth, albeit the shape of the channels and the seabed does obviously have an impact, but the bigger impact is the gravitational impact on tides. And it's not just the Moon. The Sun also contributes, albeit to a much lesser magnitude. And that is why we get our extremities of tide ranges. Hence the spring tide and neap tide are when those two bodies are either in alignment or as far out of alignment as possible. Now, the time it takes for the full tidal cycle to play out as the Moon rotates around the Earth and the Earth orbits the Sun is actually 18.6 years. So if we wanted to accurately define mean sea level, we would have to let that play out for the best part of 20 years. But realizing AHD was a priority, so they had to make a decision. So the decision they made was to sacrifice the accuracy of the definition of mean sea level and just base AHD on 3 years of data, because that fit with the time frame of capturing all the leveling required and everything else. So we're now starting to understand as much as AHD is a phenomenal undertaking. It's had limitations all the way from the get-go, just through the challenges of realizing a national vertical datum. So it was only once the Australian National Levelling Network had been completed and that the tide gauge data had been collected and processed for the 30 tide gauges that the final least squares adjustment could be undertaken to bring all of this data together. Now, computers back then were not particularly powerful. My phone absolutely has more power than anything they had access to. So they split it up into two phases. Phase one, they did 5 regional adjustments, roughly split along state lines. And then phase two, they brought those regional adjustments together and did 2 adjustments. One minimally constrained, where they just held one station to assess the quality of the leveling. And then the final adjustment, constrained to the 30 tide gauges, helped us define Australian Height Datum. And the final adjustment was run on the 5th of May, 1971. And so the Australian Height Datum was born. So basically taken them the best part of 70 years to start talking about it through to finally realizing it. And around 25, 26 years before they actually seriously started doing anything on the ground to launching what is still Australia's legal vertical datum. So that takes us up to establishing AHD. So now let's think about how AHD is modernized since 1971. So from 1971 through to May of 2000, everything worked well. AHD was fit for purpose, and there was no particular issues. There was areas where the least squares adjustment had shown us that there was statistically inferior areas. So we knew there was issues in the leveling network, but by and large, it was absolutely good. It served its purpose, and it was one of the backbones of Australia's mapping exercises. Some of the issues were just random errors. Remember, there was over 177,000 kilometers of leveling involved in realizing AHD. That's a lot of opportunity to make an honest mistake. I'm teaching students this semester leveling for the first time, and down at Flinders campus at Bedford Park, we've got the lake in the middle, and there's about a 30-meter elevation change from the bottom of the lake to the top of the lake, which is pretty mean of me, I think, to get students to try and level around that as their first attempt to make it work. And I regularly get misclosures of a couple of 100 mil. I had one group who were over 20 meters. I don't know how they managed that. But not all of the issues were random with AHD. There was also a famous fable of I think it was a contractor, and did their leveling loop, found there to be a misclosure of around 2 meters. And instead of going back into the field to work out where they'd made the mistake, they settled down with a pint in a pub in outback New South Wales somewhere, and they played with that data, and they lost that error, and it closed. So that's the one that we know about, but it's almost, well, maybe not. Who knows? Allegedly. But in May of 2000, there was an event that would actually change the future of the Australian Height Datum, or how we use it. And that event was actually Bill Clinton signing into law the end of selective availability. So up until that date, GPS, the US, had been deliberately adding error to the GPS signals. So as civilians, it wasn't usable. But there was starting to be more and more ways to circumvent that spoofing that they called it. So they finally signed it into law to get rid of it entirely, which suddenly opened it up to a whole bunch of industries and sectors that had not previously been using GPS. But the issue is, GPS is a global positioning system, and it needs a common vertical datum that works everywhere. So Australia had gone through the effort of setting up a national datum. We now needed to connect to a global datum. So again, there was challenges to be overcome. So how do we overcome that problem? GPS datums are Earth-centered and Earth-fixed. That is because the GPS satellites are orbiting around the Earth. So Earth-centered, Earth-fixed means that the origin point for the datum is the Earth's center of mass. And we know that the satellites are orbiting the Earth in their elliptical orbits. And we know that if we have an elliptical orbit, the center of mass of the Earth will be at one of those two foci points. So we can actually apply Kepler's first law of motion, which tells us that the orbit of a planet is an ellipse with the sun at one of the two foci. So if we take that same theory and apply it to the Earth, the satellites orbit around the Earth's center of mass is at one of those two foci. So to solve this challenge of the relationship between a regional definition of AHD and a global datum that we need to make GPS work, or global navigation satellite systems as we now call them, because GPS is basically the American system, but there's now Beidou, which is the Chinese, GLONASS, the Russian, Galileo, European, QZSS, Japanese. So there's multiple constellations now. We basically need to reintroduce those two words that I parked earlier, the ellipsoid and the geoid. So the ellipsoid is a nice, pure, mathematical, geometric surface that we can best fit to the size of the Earth, and we can connect it to its center of mass. Whereas the geoid is the name of an equipotential surface that best fits a model, and it's basically a gravity model of the Earth. And because we can equate the geoid to mean sea level, we can use this as our connection between our ellipsoid, purely mathematical, and mean sea level, which was the common datum that AHD used when it was established. So here we can see an ellipsoid, nice and clean, very easy to define. And here we can see an exaggerated model of the geoid. So it's exaggerated in the vertical. It looks a bit like a lumpy potato, is how I generally describe it. But if we actually scaled a cue ball up to the same size as the Earth, there'd be more roughness and undulation on that cue ball. So the Earth is still relatively smooth, but it still matters. And it matters, and please stay with me here, and hopefully I explain this well, because this is where I always struggle with my students as well, because of gravity. So we established right at the very start, gravity determines that water always flows downhill. So if we design that sewer, we want to make sure that the fluid that's traveling within it flows in the right direction. And if we poured water onto the surface of that geoid, it would not flow anywhere. It would stay still. It would just sit in a pool. So as far as gravity is concerned, the geoid is flat. Now, if we poured water onto that ellipsoid, it could flow in any direction depending on the gravity gradient at that location, and we need the geoid to tell us that. So as far as gravity is concerned, that nice clean ellipsoid is actually the uneven surface. So that's why we need the geoid to help us to determine Australian height datum now when we're using GPS. So when we get our height using a GPS device, the initial height is actually relative to the ellipsoid, which is shown by the green line on the right-hand side. And from there, we can actually use the geoid to compute our separation back to the definition of mean sea level 0, so that we can then work out how high we are above that, which is the red line, to actually work out our height to the Australian height datum. So if we're going out to a site to establish a new permanent survey mark, and we're using GPS, that is what's going on in the background for us. And this diagram here shows the current Australian geospatial reference system. So this is the backbone of what Australia currently uses to define where we are and how high we are. So the geoids are here and here, AusGeoid 2020 and AusGeoid 09. And the ellipsoid sits up here under the ATRF 2014. So remembering that the ellipsoid and geoid are not parallel surfaces, this diagram shows just how much of a slope there is between the two. So this is the gap, the difference between the ellipsoid and geoid across the Australian continent. So down in the bottom southwest corner in WA, the geoid is actually 70 meters below the ellipsoidal surface. Whereas up in far north Queensland, the geoid is actually 80 to 90 meters above the ellipsoidal surface. So that's quite a slope right across Australia. And this diagram here shows the actual accuracies of AHD. So we know that there's inherent inaccuracies. The least squares adjustment told us there were statistically inferior areas. We knew there was issues with some of the data sets, and trying to stitch all of that together with the sophistication of the least squares adjustments and the limitations of computational power back in the day, that's why it's such a phenomenal achievement that it is still used and it is still relevant today. But we just have to know that we are working with a datum, a vertical datum that has an inherent inaccuracy limitation in the range of 80 to 120 millimeters, depending on where we are. And that is generally not a problem most of the time. But as we're getting more advanced in our ability to understand where we are and how high we are, we're starting to come into issues where Australian height datum actually isn't accurate enough for some modern applications. So now quickly look to the future and where the Australian height datum is and where we're going as far as vertical datums here in Australia. So firstly, AHD is still the legal national vertical datum for Australia. But like I say, with ever greater projects, and the sort of example of something like this would be a LiDAR survey of a big, vast area using airborne LiDAR to capture vertical elevation across a huge area. If we want to validate that data set, we need to be able to use a datum that we can rely on. If we're chasing 50 millimeters accuracy in that LiDAR data set, but we're relying on a vertical datum that's got inherent inaccuracies up to 80 mil, maybe 100 mil plus, we can't actually achieve that. So it was decided when they established MGA 2020 and we had the big sort of focus on Australia's positioning infrastructure that we would actually create a second vertical datum. So bringing this diagram back up, we've got the two geoids that we talked about earlier and how we achieve AHD now. Doesn't matter which geoid we go via, we still get the same definition of AHD. It has not changed since 1971, but it has its limitations. But we also now have this other geoid, the Australian quasi-geoid model, which allows us to define the Australian vertical working surface. So I would hazard a guess, maybe one or two people in here have even heard that that exists, because hardly anybody in the industry knows that it exists, to be perfectly honest. So here we can see the sort of patchy inaccuracies that we know are within AHD. And if you look closely, particularly through the eastern seaboard, you can also almost see the linear alignments of the Australian National Levelling Network and now how it's not a uniform inaccuracy. Whereas with the Australian vertical working surface, what they've done is the geoid that we use to define AHD has two components. The gravimetric, the geoid is a geoid model, is a gravity model, but also a geometric component, which is the contribution of the Australian National Levelling Network. By eliminating that levelling network, we can get a much smoother, more accurate datum across the whole of Australia. And we know that it is more accurate because GPS was that technology that allowed us to define vertical to a much higher accuracy than levelling ever was able to allow us to achieve. Because the instrument, I've got the example down here, but if you're leveling for hundreds of kilometers, you can do it as accurately as you can, but you're still going to accumulate millimeters of error. So over the sort of distances that we were talking to level across Australia, you're going to accumulate a lot of error, whether you are the absolute best at leveling in the whole world. Whereas GPS is much better at that relative vertical accuracy over long distances. So now, if we can improve our understanding of that gravity model, we can continue to refine and improve the Australian vertical working surface. So the Australian gravimetric quasi-geoid is not a fixed geoid now. They're open to improving that as our data increases and our understanding of the gravity model for Australia improves. And this is ongoing very recently. So October 2024, this is a data set from Victoria, where they've flown airborne LiDAR over big chunks of the state, and they're continuing to do this, and the plan is to have this across the whole of Victoria. I don't know exactly what South Australia's plan is at the moment, whether they're doing this. I suspect they probably are, or at least working towards it. And I'll just try and check the sound here. Let me just bring up the volume thing over here so I can turn it down if I need to. Because the next slide has a nice little video from New South Wales with what they're doing at the moment.
Data is increasingly becoming the currency of the 21st century. To build the smart cities of the future and enable better management of our resources, infrastructure and natural hazards, we need accurate data. Throughout 2022 and 2023, the New South Wales Government will produce an updated gravity model of New South Wales that will improve the accuracy of real-world heights from GPS positioning to an accuracy of just a few centimetres. Data will be captured by airborne gravity surveys in 5 separate stages across New South Wales, starting in Western New South Wales and then moving east to the coast. Aircraft will fly 300 metres high over towns and cities, and as low as 150 metres high in other areas. As the gravity instrument used is passive, meaning it does not emit any type of signal, there will be no impact on people, animals or infrastructure. From the ground, the plane will be no louder than a passing car. An accurate gravity model will enable more sophisticated measurement and modelling of the terrain, water flow and flood mapping. This new data will advance the science that helps the New South Wales Government to manage our earth resources, infrastructure and natural hazards. It will also assist the state's resources sector, which contributes to regional jobs and economic growth. The New South Wales gravity model is the missing piece in delivering the accurate and reliable spatial infrastructure needed to deliver smart precincts, smart cities, and a smart New South Wales, leading to the development of a digitally and spatially enabled society. The data will be licensed for public use, freely available through the government's open data platforms, as well as included in the National Geoscience Database and data portals.
So that's where the future's moving to. But importantly, AHD is still there. We still use it day in, day out. Almost every surveyor, if they're tying their survey to a vertical datum, will use AHD. Like I say, the Australian vertical working surface, hardly anyone knows it exists. But it is there to take us forwards. But I think the fact that AHD is still so relevant and still serves such a solid foundation for our understanding of vertical, for something that was first dreamt up at Federation, albeit it took 40 odd years of talking before they managed to actually do anything. And then 25, 26 years of actual leveling, which is understandable that it takes that long to sort of level around the Earth 4.5 times. But it's stood the test of time. It is still a phenomenal sort of effort and achievement. And that is one of my own personal pictures. So I was waiting for my assistant to walk and hold the staff at the next point as I was doing one of those leveling jobs that every surveyor has an anecdote about. That particular one was on the Tanami Road. I think we had to level about 9-10 kilometers. And we had to do it early in the morning before the sun heat haze got too much, and also before the flies woke up. I remember my first experience with the flies, and we started leveling early in the morning, no flies, it was still pretty chill. And just as it warmed up, the buzzing, and it got worse and worse. And it actually got to sort of 9 o'clock, and I had to just pause everything, left the level set up by the side of the road, drove to the nearest community, and luckily they had one of the head nets. I just bought one of those for the day. So, but yeah, that is my little picture of leveling in the outback. So there's all the references I've used to actually pull all this information together, and that is it. Thank you very much.